She built a house in the trunk of an oak tree for a dog that everyone feared. People laughed until they saw what this dog did when the wolves came. Watch until the end, and you'll understand why there are always flowers lying under this tree now. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The town of Maple Creek was the kind of place where mornings arrived with a pale mist and the scent of smoke curling from chimneys. The oak trees framed the road like watchmen, their branches heavy and old, and every sound carried in the open air: the bark of a dog, the clang of a gate, the rhythm of a faraway hammer. People there lived slowly, by the rhythm of seasons and the quiet endurance of habit. Among them was Grace Miller, a 52-year-old widow who lived on the edge of town in a small, weather-worn house that had once belonged to her husband's parents. It stood near the pastures, close enough to the forest that at night she could hear the wind moving through the trees like the breath of something alive. Grace had been alone for nearly 6 years. Her husband, Daniel, had been a firefighter in Helena before his death in a warehouse collapse. After the funeral, she sold everything they had, left the city behind, and returned to the house she once swore she'd never see again. People in Maple Creek remembered her from childhood, quiet, polite, with eyes that seemed to observe more than they spoke. They pitied her, but they did not quite understand her. She had no children, no company, and no interest in gossip or church picnics. She helped mend fences, patched neighbors' roofs, treated sick livestock when she could. In town, they said she was good with animals, but not much with people. The hills beyond her property were dotted with sheep and scattered barns. Those pastures belonged mostly to the Henderson and Jacobs families, whose flocks had been the pride of the valley for decades. Before Tom Jacobs passed away, he had owned the best dog in 3 counties, a German shepherd named Ranger. He was a massive creature, dark-coated, with amber eyes that seemed to understand speech. Ranger could round up 200 sheep alone and drive them straight through the open fields without losing one. When Tom died of a heart attack in the middle of a storm, the dog refused to leave the pasture. He slept beside the man's coat for 3 days before moving back to the herd on his own. People were touched by that loyalty. They brought him scraps, called him the guardian of Maple Creek. Over time, though, the sympathy faded. The Hendersons took over Tom's grazing land, and no one wanted to claim the old dog. He kept patrolling out of habit, a silent figure crossing the slopes at dawn and dusk. Then came the night that broke the town's faith. It was early autumn, the first cold snap, when frost glazed the grass and the moon hung low and sharp above the fields. In the morning, Paul Henderson found nearly 24 sheep scattered across the ground, their throats torn open. Blood darkened the soil. The air smelled of iron and wet wool. He shouted for help, and soon men from every house arrived with lanterns and rifles. The sight left them pale and angry. The only living thing nearby was Ranger. He stood at the edge of the carnage, his muzzle stained red, his chest rising and falling. He did not run. He did not growl. He simply looked at them, and that was enough. Paul shouted first, his voice trembling. "It's him! God help me! It's that mutt! Look at him!" Others joined in. They wanted someone to blame, something to expel from their fear. The tracks were messy, half hidden in the churned earth, and no one cared to look closer. They saw paws and blood and a dog. By afternoon, half the town had gathered near the Henderson barn. Mr. Carson, the mayor, stood on a crate and tried to sound decisive. He was a man of few doubts and many gestures. "You all know what has to be done," he said. "He's gone wild. There's no reason in him now. You keep a beast like that around, and next time, it'll be one of your children." Grace had come with a basket of herbs for an ailing calf and found herself among the crowd. She listened in disbelief. "That dog wouldn't harm a soul," she said quietly. "You've seen him guard the flock since Tom died. You've seen him drive wolves off before." Her voice was drowned in the noise of anger. Men muttered about rabies, about the cost of the dead sheep. Fear made them certain. By evening, they took Ranger to the edge of town. Someone struck him with a stick. Another threw a rock. He didn't fight back. He only turned once, looked toward the herd he had protected, and walked into the woods. When the shouting died, Grace stood alone on the dirt road. She saw the streaks of blood on the dust where he had passed and felt a heaviness settle over her chest. The sun dipped behind the hills, the light burning red through the clouds. She thought of how quiet the fields would be that night, and how long the shadows of guilt could stretch. The following days were uneasy. The men spoke loudly about fences and new dogs, but their laughter had a hollow ring. The nights grew colder. The moon disappeared behind thick clouds, and with it went a sense of safety. Wolves were heard again, closer than before, their cries echoing through the ravines. No one said it aloud, but many wished Ranger had never left. Grace spent her evenings by the window, sewing or reading, though her eyes often wandered to the forest line. She imagined the dog wandering hungry and wounded, sleeping under fallen branches. She told herself not to think about it, but compassion was a habit she could not unlearn. One afternoon, carrying a basket of gathered herbs, she followed the narrow path that led to the river. The woods there were older than the town, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. The wind whispered through them like the slow speech of time. That was where she saw him again. Ranger lay beneath a massive oak that stood apart from the others, its roots sprawling like frozen serpents. His coat was dull with dirt, his ribs visible beneath the fur. When she approached, he raised his head but did not growl. His eyes were clear and tired, as though they had seen through judgment to something quieter. Grace knelt a few feet away and placed a piece of bread on the ground. "You're not the killer they think you are," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You just stayed too long where no one deserved you." She backed away and left him the food. The next day she returned, and the bread was gone. She left more, bits of meat, water, small gestures of faith. For several days she repeated the ritual. Each time she came, he was nearer to the path, less guarded, his tail twitching faintly. She never reached to touch him. Trust was a fragile thing, and she knew it had to be earned without demand. The townsfolk noticed her trips into the woods. They asked questions half in jest, half in warning. "Still feeding that beast?" one man said near the store. Grace ignored him. Others whispered that grief had made her strange. She heard them but felt detached, as though their voices came from another world. There was a strange peace in her silence, in those small journeys through the cold air. It reminded her of caring for Daniel during his last illness, how love often meant doing something no one else believed in. As autumn deepened, frost formed on the edges of the oak's roots. The leaves above turned copper and fell one by one. Grace brought an old blanket one morning and laid it beside the tree. Ranger sniffed at it and lay down, his head resting on his paws. The gesture felt like a promise between them, wordless but binding. In the evenings, she thought of the town's cruelty. They had always been quick to judge. Maybe that was how people survived in a place where winter could strip everything bare. But she had seen enough loss to know that mercy was rarer and worth more than pride. When she looked at Ranger, she saw something beyond guilt or innocence. She saw devotion misunderstood, loyalty punished, because it reminded people of their own cowardice. Snow came early that year. The fields whitened. The sheep were kept close to barns. Grace watched the flakes settle on the window and wondered if the dog still breathed beneath the oak. She would find out soon enough, she thought. The path to the woods was narrow but familiar, and she walked it now with the same certainty with which she once walked beside her husband. Each day she left food. Each day the tracks near the oak grew clearer. Ranger was alive. He waited for her, though she pretended not to notice. They were two outcasts meeting at the border between forgiveness and fear. The nights grew darker. Sometimes she woke from dreams where the dog was running through snow, the sound of wolves behind him, her own name lost in the wind. She would light a lamp and sit until dawn, the silence of the house pressing on her chest. The town had already forgotten its own verdict. People rarely spoke of the massacre anymore. New fears had replaced old ones. The cold, the price of feed, the thinning ice on the river. But Grace carried the memory of that day like a secret burden. Each time she looked toward the forest, she felt the same quiet pull of conviction that what everyone believed had been wrong. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, she saw Ranger waiting at the edge of her yard. He did not move, only watched. Then, as if recognizing that she saw him, he turned and walked back toward the oak. She followed slowly, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. When she reached the tree, he was already lying down. She sat nearby, not too close, feeling the stillness between them settle into something like companionship. In the distance, the wolves howled again, their voices long and low. Ranger's ears twitched, and for a moment, his old strength seemed to return, the muscles tightening, eyes alert. Grace looked toward the darkening horizon and understood that this fragile peace wasn't meant to last. The forest held its breath. The night carried the promise of something waiting to test them both. When she rose to leave, she turned once more toward him. The oak loomed behind them, its vast trunk like a sentinel between two worlds. "Good night, boy," she whispered. "You're not alone anymore." He blinked slowly, as if to answer, and laid his head down. The wind sighed through the branches, scattering the last of the leaves. Grace walked home through the snow, unaware that this quiet, uneasy bond between a woman and an outcast dog would soon decide the fate of the entire town. And so the first chapter of their shared redemption closed in silence beneath the ancient oak that waited patiently for what was to come. The first heavy snow of the season fell 2 days after Grace saw Ranger waiting at the edge of her yard. By morning, the fields had turned white, the fences half buried, and the forest stood silent beneath its cold crown. From her kitchen window, she could see the trail leading to the oak, a faint, uneven line across the frozen ground where her boots had worn a path. Somewhere beyond that white expanse, the dog lay under the sheltering branches, enduring the cold, the way wild things always did, without complaint, without hope. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, thinking about him, about the way his eyes had looked the last time she saw him. Calm, watchful, patient, as if he had already forgiven everything that had been done to him. The house creaked around her, the sound of wood settling in the cold. It was the same sound Daniel used to call the breathing of the walls. Grace missed that simple comfort, the presence of someone who understood silence. Now, her world consisted of small rituals: lighting the stove, mending her coat, boiling water for tea, walking to the oak. Each task had become a thread in the fabric of survival, and somewhere between those threads, she found a fragile kind of peace. But the thought of Ranger in the open, with his wounded leg and thinning coat, gnawed at her. The temperature was dropping each night. She imagined frost forming on his fur, the slow hunger that came with the season. That morning, after finishing her coffee, she wrapped herself in her husband's old parka, took a shovel, a hammer, and a few boards from the shed, and set out toward the forest. The air was brittle, sharp in her lungs. The path to the oak was harder to follow now, the snow covering most of her old footprints. When she reached the tree, Ranger was there, lying in the hollow space between its roots. He lifted his head as she approached, but didn't move away. His breath steamed faintly in the air. The sight of him stirred something deep in her chest, a tenderness mixed with defiance. She set down the tools and touched the trunk of the tree. The bark was rough, but strangely warm, as though it held a pulse of its own. "This will keep you warm," she murmured. She didn't know whether she was speaking to the dog or to the oak itself. She began by clearing the snow and scraping away the damp soil near the base. The ground beneath was firm, dry. She remembered something her father once told her when she was a child, that the oldest oaks in Montana had hollow trunks wide enough for a man to stand inside. She decided to test that. With the hammer and chisel, she started to work, chipping slowly at the dead wood that lined one side of the trunk. It was harder than she expected. The blows echoed in the still air like heartbeats. Ranger watched her, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed, but never leaving her. She worked for hours. The light faded to gold, then to gray. When her arms began to tremble, she stopped and leaned against the tree. The hollow she'd made wasn't deep yet, but she could already imagine it. An alcove wide enough for the dog to curl inside, protected from the wind and snow. The thought made her smile. When she returned the next day, the air had warmed slightly. The snow around the oak had melted into a thin crust of ice, and for a strange moment, she thought the tree looked different, alive in a way she couldn't quite name. Its bark glistened, as if the sunlight were caught beneath the surface. She began carving again, the rhythm of her strikes steady and sure. Sometimes she spoke while she worked, telling Ranger stories about Daniel or about her childhood in Maple Creek. He seemed to listen, his ears twitching at her voice. By the third day, she had carved out a hollow nearly 3 feet deep. She lined the bottom with straw and pine needles, layered an old blanket inside, and leaned a few boards over the opening to create a roof. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and it looked like it belonged there, as though the oak had been waiting for it all along. Ranger sniffed at the entrance, stepped inside cautiously, turned twice, and lay down. His tail thumped once against the floor. Grace laughed softly. "There," she said. "A home." When she left that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. The stars came out, sharp and bright, scattered like ice across the sky. The world felt vast, but somehow more forgiving. Word of her project spread through the town within a few days. People noticed her carrying tools and wood toward the forest. At the general store, 2 men joked that she was building a shrine to the devil's dog. Someone else said she was trying to tame a killer. Grace heard the laughter but didn't react. She had learned long ago that people mocked what they didn't understand. When Mrs. Carson stopped her in front of the post office and asked what she was doing in the woods, Grace simply said, "Trying to save something worth saving." The woman frowned and muttered a prayer under her breath. The days passed, and Grace kept visiting the oak. She brought scraps of food, replaced the straw when it got damp, brushed the snow from the entrance. Ranger grew stronger, his coat thickening again. Sometimes she would find him standing outside the hollow, looking toward the fields, his posture alert, as if listening for something only he could hear. Once, she followed his gaze and saw a set of prints in the snow wolf tracks, faint but unmistakable. The sight made her heart tighten. Winter deepened. The wind began to howl through the forest like a wounded thing. Grace's breath froze against her scarf as she trudged back and forth between the oak and her house. The work was exhausting, but it gave her purpose. She started leaving her lantern burning in the window at night, just in case Ranger ever came that far. He never did, but she liked the idea that he might see the light. One night, as she sat near the stove with a cup of tea, she heard a distant howling echo across the valley. It was long, drawn out, haunting. She thought of the wolf tracks and the way Ranger had stared into the dark. Instinct told her trouble was near. She wrapped herself in her coat and stepped outside. The sky was clear, the stars brittle with cold. In the distance, near the line of the forest, she thought she saw movement shadows shifting among the trees. Her heart began to race. She wanted to go to the oak, but stopped herself. There was nothing she could do in the dark. Instead, she whispered a prayer to the still night, a plea for the safety of the dog who had once protected everyone else. When she went back inside, she left the lantern burning until dawn. The following morning, she found the snow near the oak disturbed. Ranger was unharmed, though his fur was dusted with frost. He wagged his tail once when she arrived, and she took it as a sign that the night had passed without bloodshed. Still, she could not shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding. Something inevitable. By mid-January, the laughter in town had turned to uneasy silence. Farmers spoke of missing sheep again. Some claimed they saw eyes shining near the tree line at dusk. Grace listened quietly. She wanted to tell them that the dog they feared was the only thing standing between them and the real danger. But she knew they would not hear her. Fear had made them deaf before. It would do so again. One afternoon, as she left the store, Mr. Carson stopped her. "You know that dog's bad luck, Grace," he said. "If he comes near the herds again, I won't have a choice. Folks are talking about shooting him." She looked at him steadily. "He's the reason your fields are still standing," she replied. "You'd see that if you ever looked past your own fear." He shook his head, muttering something about foolish women and their pity. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the snow drift under the light of the moon. Every few minutes, she thought she heard a faint sound, a distant growl, a rustle among the trees, but it might have been only the wind. She rose before sunrise and walked to the oak. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. When she reached the clearing, she found Ranger standing beside the hollow, facing the forest. His fur was bristling, his body tense. Grace stopped, afraid to break whatever spell held him there. After a long moment, he turned his head toward her, and in that look, she read both warning and acceptance. Something was coming. She placed a hand against the tree, feeling the faint vibration beneath the bark, as if the oak itself sensed what lay ahead. The sky above was turning gray, the color of old steel. The world felt poised on the edge of change. She whispered softly, "Whatever happens, you're not alone." Ranger gave a low bark, almost a reply, then retreated into the hollow. Grace lingered for a while before heading home. She glanced back once and saw the faint outline of the oak rising against the pale horizon, the small dark shape of the dog inside it, like a heart beating within stone. In town, people spoke of wolves that night, of new tracks near the river, of eyes gleaming in the dark. Grace listened, silent and thoughtful. The air felt heavy, the way it did before a storm. Something in her knew that soon, all the lines she had drawn between kindness and fear, life and loss, would blur. The shelter she had built, carved from patience and faith, was more than a refuge now. It was a promise, one that would soon be tested. When she looked toward the forest at dusk, the horizon burned with the orange glow of sunset. The oak stood dark and still, its branches spreading like open arms. And somewhere beneath those arms, waiting for whatever might come, lay the dog who had once been accused and cast out, now the last guardian of a town that had forgotten how to believe in loyalty. The wind carried a strange stillness that morning, the kind that comes before change. Grace woke early, her body restless, her mind filled with a quiet unease she couldn't name. The house was colder than usual. Frost glazed the window panes, and the fire in the stove had burned itself out. She dressed quickly, pulled Daniel's old parka over her shoulders, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, so cold it stung the inside of her nose. From the edge of her yard, she could see the faint trail leading through the fields toward the forest. The sky was the color of iron, and everything, trees, fences, even the river, seemed frozen in anticipation. She knew before she saw the tracks that something had happened during the night. The snow was disturbed near the edge of the woods, as if many feet had moved there in confusion. She followed them slowly, her breath forming a white cloud before her. When she reached the clearing where the oak stood, she saw Ranger lying in the snow beside his hollow, his body tense and alert. He lifted his head and gave a soft growl that wasn't meant for her. His eyes were fixed on the dark line of trees. The fur along his spine stood upright, and Grace understood. The wolves had come closer again. She crouched beside him and touched his shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. He didn't take his eyes off the forest. For a long moment, they both listened. The woods were silent except for the slow creaking of frozen branches. Then, far off, came a sound, a single, distant howl, drawn out like a warning. Ranger stood. He looked at her once, then back to the forest, and Grace felt something inside her tighten, a foreboding that pressed like a stone against her heart. All that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting. She went into town for supplies, though she didn't need anything, just to be among people. At the store, the air was full of talk. Farmers spoke of more missing sheep, of shapes moving through the snow at night, of footprints too large for coyotes. Someone said he had seen eyes shining near the schoolhouse, bright as coins. The laughter that followed was uneasy. Mr. Carson stood by the counter, his face pale. "If that dog of yours is anywhere near them," he said when he saw her, "you'll wish you'd never brought him back." Grace met his gaze steadily. "If you'd kept your rifles pointed in the right direction the first time," she said, "we wouldn't be having this talk." She turned and left without waiting for a reply. The sun was already setting when she reached home. The light was thin, red on the snow. She boiled water for tea but couldn't drink it. Every few minutes, she found herself staring toward the forest. The silence outside had changed. It felt deeper, heavier. Even the crows were quiet. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat by the window until darkness swallowed the fields. Somewhere out there, under the oak, the dog waited alone. When the attack came, it came without sound. Later, people would say they heard nothing until the screaming began. A group of children had been playing near the old creek, just beyond the last line of houses, rolling snowballs and sliding down the hill. Their laughter drifted faintly through the cold air, innocent and unaware. Then, from the shadows, the wolves appeared, 5 of them, gaunt with hunger, their ribs sharp under their fur, their eyes burning yellow. They moved like ghosts through the snow, silent until the first child turned and saw them. Grace was at her window when she heard the cry. It was high and thin, the sound of terror piercing the quiet like a blade. She froze for a second, then ran for her boots. She didn't think, didn't even grab her coat. The cold hit her as she burst out the door, the wind whipping her hair. The screams carried over the fields, mingled with the wild snarling of animals. She ran as fast as she could, her breath ragged, her feet slipping in the snow. By the time she reached the clearing near the creek, she saw a blur of movement shapes locked together in chaos, white snow stained red. The wolves were closing in around the children, and then, like a shadow breaking free from the trees, Ranger appeared. He hurled himself into the fray, a dark streak against the pale ground. His roar filled the air. One wolf went down instantly under his weight. Another turned, snapping at him, but he was faster, stronger, driven by something older than fear. The children scattered, running toward the nearest fence. Grace watched in horror and awe as the dog fought. He moved with the desperate grace of something that knew this was the final battle it would ever fight. The wolves circled him, teeth bared, but he didn't yield. He lunged, bit, turned, drove them back one by one. The snow churned beneath them, each breath a cloud of steam, each sound raw and terrible. He took wound slashes along his flank, a deep bite to the shoulder, but he didn't fall. His focus was absolute. He was no longer the outcast of Maple Creek, no longer the accused. He was the guardian again, the protector he had always been. When the last of the wolves fled into the forest, silence returned as suddenly as the storm had come. The children huddled together, crying, their faces pale with shock. Ranger stood motionless in the snow, blood matting his fur, his sides heaving. Grace ran to him. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his neck. "It's over," she whispered. "You did it. You saved them." He looked at her with those same calm eyes, the light already fading from them. His breath came shallow now, each exhale a whisper of steam. She cradled his head in her lap, tears freezing on her cheeks. People began to arrive, men with rifles, women wrapped in coats, the mayor shouting orders that no one listened to. They stopped when they saw Grace and the dog. The children ran to their parents, sobbing. Mr. Carson took off his hat. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the oak branches above, heavy with snow. Grace stroked Ranger's fur, murmuring to him words that no one else could hear. His tail twitched once, a faint echo of the life that was slipping away. He exhaled softly and went still. Grace stayed there long after the others had carried the children home. The stars came out, cold and distant. The moon rose over the hills, turning the snow silver. She felt the warmth leave the body in her arms, but she didn't let go. For the first time since Daniel's death, she wept openly, her tears falling onto the dog's fur. She wept for him, for herself, for the small cruelties of a world that punished loyalty as if it were sin. They buried him the next morning at the foot of the oak. The whole town came, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or shame, or the need to be forgiven. Grace said nothing. She laid a hand on the mound of snow that covered the grave, then stood back. Someone placed a wooden cross there, carved from an old fence post. Another man left a bowl of water. When it was done, they all went home, leaving her alone in the clearing. The days that followed were quieter than any she could remember. The wolves did not return. The sheep roamed safely again. People spoke of the dog now with reverence, calling him a hero, as if their words could erase the months of hatred that had come before. Grace listened, but she didn't join in. She knew the truth, that Ranger had never needed their praise. He had only needed their trust, and when he couldn't find it, he had done what no man among them had the courage to do. 1 week later, something extraordinary happened. Grace had gone to the oak at dawn, carrying fresh flowers to place on the grave. The air was still, the sky streaked with soft light. As she approached, she stopped in disbelief. The great oak was budding green shoots pushing through the bark, leaves unfurling like hands. In the dead of winter, when everything else lay frozen, this tree had come alive. She reached out and touched one of the leaves. It was warm. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not from sorrow this time, but from awe. "You did it," she whispered. "You're still here." Word spread through Maple Creek. People came to see the miracle. They stood around the oak in silence, hats in hand, the frost crunching under their boots. No one could explain it. Mr. Carson crossed himself and muttered a prayer. Children who had been rescued laid small stones and ribbons at the base of the tree. The wind stirred its branches, and the sound was almost like breathing. Spring came early that year. The snow melted faster than anyone expected. The river swelled, and the fields turned green again. The oak remained lush and strong, its leaves a deeper green than any other in the valley. Grace visited every day. She would sit by the trunk, her back against the bark, and talk softly about her life, about Daniel, about the way the world had changed since that day. The townsfolk began calling it the Guardian's Tree. One morning, as she approached, she saw movement near the grave. A small white shape emerged from the shadows, a puppy, its fur soft and pale with a single dark patch on its shoulder. It sat among the roots, watching her with wide eyes. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around but saw no tracks, no sign of a mother. The puppy barked once, high and uncertain, and took a few steps toward her. She knelt, opening her arms. "Well," she said, smiling through tears, "I suppose he didn't want me to be alone." She named the puppy Scout. He followed her everywhere, small paws leaving prints beside her boots. When she worked in the garden, he would sit nearby, watching the sky. At night he slept by the door, just as Ranger once had. The oak towered behind the house, visible even from her window, its leaves whispering in the wind. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, Grace would look out and think she saw a shadow beneath the tree. A tall shape, motionless, guarding. She never told anyone about it. Some things were better, left between the living and the loyal dead. She would smile, stroke the puppy's head, and whisper, "Thank you, boy, for everything." And in the rustle of the oak leaves, in the hush that settled over Maple Creek, it always seemed that something, perhaps the wind, perhaps memory, answered her back. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other stories on the channel. Each one carries its own secret. And if you know someone who'd feel this too, share this video with them.